Hey, very good afternoon to everybody. My name is Natalie McCoy. Along with Yana Hasova, who's also in today's webinar, am a co-chair of the Energy Regulators, Consumers, and Retail Market Working Groups in ACER and CER. And we and very knowledgeable, dedicated group of experts on both sides prepare the annual market monitoring report, which we're very pleased to present to you today. You may have seen it was published last week on our websites, and today we'd like to give you a little bit more insight into the analysis, findings, recommendations that we've put together for this year's report. I have a few little housekeeping announcements to make. You've probably seen in the chat that the event is being recorded. We hope that's okay with you. We would like to post it on our ACER YouTube and also our websites following the event. And so that should be available from tomorrow if all goes well with technology. And also the slides from today's event will be posted on both websites, ACER-CEER, and they hopefully by the end of today, if not the latest tomorrow, they will be available for everybody's reference. Finally, Slido. We will be using Slido today instead of the chat system here in Teams. You've seen in the chat box there's a web link. There's also a QR code. You can also directly hover over the link on this presentation here, and it should take you to our Slido page, which we'll be using to collect questions and for our discussion during the webinar. Okay. We ask everybody please to remember to keep your microphones muted unless we pass you the floor. And you can also, through the Slido function, you can like other people's questions and increase their visibility. And then we know we really have to answer them. And of course, any major substantive questions we'll do during the Q&A to allow our speakers to complete their presentations as we go. So having covered all the logistics and the housekeeping, I'm very pleased to welcome, well, so far over 150 participants. We're very proud of our work. It's a year-long process, and we're hoping that you will find the results interesting as we have. Today we have with us illustrious panel, if I can say that. Some opening remarks from my co-chair, Jana Hasova, whose day job is at the Czech Energy Regulatory Authority. Of course, we also have ACER in the person of Sheila Bartok, who will give us the main conclusions and recommendations from this year's report. Also very exciting to have with us the CEO of ACER-CEER, who will present information and findings on consumer demand trends and what we see happening across Europe from before the crisis, during, and coming up to now. Finally, not least, we have a case study to show you the kinds of things that we can all do, depending on where we are in the value chain, if you will, of the energy sector, to reach out to consumers, to engage with them about their energy consumption, to help to sensitize them to when is a good time to use their devices, when is a good time to save money, including, and to be aware of how their use impacts the system and also their bills. So that I think is also very useful and important communication, information, and dialogue with all of us as consumers in this society. So we'll be hearing from Sarah a little bit later about the Irish experience so far. Without further ado, maybe I'll pass on to our opening speaker, Jana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I hope you can hear me. So, good afternoon also from my side. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. On behalf of ACER and CEER, I am honored to be here today to welcome you to today's webinar to launch the recent edition of the ACER-CEER Market Monitoring Report, the Energy Retail and Consumer Protection chapter. This comprehensive report, and as also Natalie mentioned, was published last Tuesday and provides a detailed analysis of Europe's energy markets for consumers. Let me please share with you some introductory words on this annual monitoring analysis. Since 2021, the energy sector has experienced significant shifts and faced unprecedented challenges, and it's crucial to understand, but also to address the implications of these developments. 2022 was a very difficult year for EU energy consumers and retail markets, as the post-pandemic recovery and Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused wholesale energy prices to spike, which then heavily impacted consumers' bills. Against this background, this year's Energy Retail and Consumer Protection Market Monitoring Report finds that retail electricity and gas prices rose significantly in response to wholesale price spikes. Despite the recent 2023 wholesale electricity prices reductions, end-user prices are falling at slower rates. Governments provided a wide range of support measures to their residential and industrial customers. An important lesson from 2022 is the need to further target support measures to those most in need, if and when support is needed, and to incentivize society to cut its energy consumption. The crisis triggered demand reductions, particularly among industrial customers. On the contrary, energy demand in the household sector was not highly affected by the energy crisis. It's obvious that this wave of unprecedented events is still affecting the markets and ultimately consumers, especially the vulnerable ones who should be protected from volatility, uncertainty, and risks to their security of supply. We are all very aware of the impact of the energy crisis to the profound changes and of the impact of this is having on our economies. To move forward effectively, it's essential to have a comprehensive understanding of what is happening in the markets. More than ever, this analysis undertaken by ACER and CEER in its market monitoring report assumes greater importance. This report equips us with the knowledge required to make informed decisions for the future. In order to chart a course toward a sustainable and resilient energy landscape, we must first be grounded in the realities of the current situation. The insights gathered in this report offer us a valuable window into the dynamics of the European energy market, shedding light on important aspects such as the energy crisis, energy consumption, prices, information and compliance, consumer protection, retail market structure, and consumer engagement. As regulators, we stress the importance of targeting measures and support where they are most needed. We also fully support the European Commission's determination to intensify the path towards decarbonization to help to overcome this crisis and to keep incentives for energy efficiency alongside consumer protection efforts. We must also be careful to distinguish between short-term interventions and long-term goals for our energy sector and economy overall. Throughout the following presentations, we will not only examine the key findings of the ACER-CEER Market Monitoring Report, but also the recommendations that can help us navigate the evolving landscape of the energy market. So without further ado, let us embark on this journey through the ACER-CEER Market Monitoring Report. We all hope you will find the information and analysis of great interest. So Natalie, please, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jana. Indeed, some interesting reflections, and we're going to hear more about that now from Sheila Bartok, presenting us some conclusions and the recommendations going forward from the lessons we've learned in the last year, the hard lessons, some might say, that we've learned in the last year. Sheila.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Jana, for the introductory words, and good afternoon to everyone. Then, with any further ado, I would like to then dive into the first slide so that we very quickly also and efficiently capture the conclusions and recommendations of this very colorful report, which has a really very good analysis on the prices, interesting case studies, and captures all the elements on retail market structure that Jana should call our attention to. So the first slide is about the year-on-year electricity price increases, and they have increased. It's very interesting to take a longer view of the period, and we can see that we had relatively stable prices. On the slides, you can see both household and industrial prices. If we take a kind of a more distant look at them, then of course one thing that you notice is this kind of relative price stability before COVID. We also notice, maybe less obviously from this slide, but we also notice that our energy system is changing. We have more renewables in the system, and of course that raises, of course, not only shorter term but longer term challenges in order to change our systems. And very obviously, what the slides highlights is the impact of the energy crisis, which is an external event. And there we had a drastic increase. And of course, the increase started with the gas price increases, which then were then impacting the electricity wholesale prices, and then ultimately the retail prices. And of course, government stepped in to assist the consumers as the prices unveiled, and then we also see that hedging strategies, which at the beginning of the crisis shielded consumers, and you know, the prices were kind of staying. Ultimately, when the contracts were sort of renewed, then these higher prices were visible then on the consumer bills, both households and industry. Can we go to the next slide? So the next slide dives deeper into the monthly data, so what was happening and how prices increased. And obviously, we see that the energy component was the one that was driving this increase. We also see as well that after prices peak, we have a sort of decrease in prices, which is the good news, and then would allow to think about the support measures that have been employed during the crisis, and to remove some of them which are not necessary. We also see that the relatively higher price levels remain after the crisis as compared to the before crisis levels. And we can move then to the next slide. There were also different strategies, and I think that's very interesting because countries reacted differently to the crisis. And then you can see two blocks, two different groups of countries proposing then different approaches to it. And then one group of countries decided not to do any intervention into the wholesale prices, and there you can see this price movement. So there is an increase in prices, and then you see slowly a price decrease to different levels, which of course is impacted by the national specifics that was happening. And you can see, for example, in the Danish case, prices a little bit more to the level below crisis, which is also related that there were some interventions on taxes and levies. And then you also see some sticky prices here in the case of Ireland, where just now the prices start to decrease, which has been explained so far to us with the hedging strategies that companies have. And then you have very flat, maybe one more sentence for the previous slide. And then you have very, very flat prices, which then there you have a different challenge. So in those cases, consumers have not received price signals. So the challenge remains there. What we are going, how these consumers would be then, if these prices remain as they are, how consumers would be reacting to a more variable supply, which is more based on renewables. So the question remains whether this is a good design going forward with the energy transition. Now we can go to the next slide. This slide has practically shows two big topics, two big stories. The first one is about how the prices increased from Q1 2022 to Q1 2023, and we can see that the price increase was substantial. And then the dark blue lines show the measures that were coming in, and those measures eventually reduced the prices for the consumers, which allowed greater affordability for them. But of course, measures came with an important cost, and now prices decrease. we have to think about to bring the systems into a more efficient mode of functioning. And it's also interesting, and that I will not enter into the details, but you can take a look at the slides once they are distributed. In some countries, the measures were so strong that eventually they intervened into the prices that took the prices below the pre-crisis levels. And I think there definitely there is some sort of lesson that needs to be drawn, like how we are doing these measures, how tailored and targeted they are, that there should be responding to the crisis and not necessarily beyond. We can move to the next slide. So here, again, another sort of angle and still the same topic. You could see eventually how the measures were sort of reducing the pressure on consumer prices. That is the gray line. And you could see how the prices would have looked like if there were no measures employed. And you could see the improvements that these measures did. But we also noticed that there were important fiscal costs that arose, very different in the countries. We have some countries where this ate up a substantive part of the GDP. And then you could see also in the previous examples that there were more moderate approaches. What is quite important, then the measures were not really targeted. Less than a quarter of them were targeted to the vulnerables and to those ones that were more in need. So it meant that a little bit the dimensioning of the measures was missing as the crisis exploded with that swiftness that we have observed in 2022. So what remains important then when we do, what lessons we learned from this? I think that is the most important discussion point here. And we have to see what we would need to improve in order to make the measures more targeted. Do we understand who are our vulnerable users are? And then how we would then keep looking at it and improve the ways in which we scope policy measures. Next slide, please. And this is exactly on this slide that targetedness definitely needs to be managed. Temporary, we have to understand if we see the price decreases, then some of the emergency measures certainly should be removed and not extended. And then we have to look into the tailoring, and maybe tailoring is more difficult because markets are different and you have different situations in the countries. Of course, you can use similar approaches, but maybe certain challenges are bigger in one country and then maybe smaller in others. So those elements need to be assessed closely and locally, and then fit for purpose measures should be built up. Very important to look into the energy efficiency and energy savings. What we can do in that area, energy savings and specifically demand reductions was helping to stabilize our markets during the crisis. So the element need to be looked into very closely. And what is the main takeaway here, that we would need to assist all consumers to lower consumption. I think that would be one way that we would need to look into. And it's not surprisingly the demand reduction measures were extended as at the union level. So that's an important thing to do. And then we have to look at the vulnerable consumers. And eventually, it's not only about helping them, but what would be very important to remove their vulnerability going forward. That connects to energy efficiency, that connects to behaviors and everything. More deeply into this topic is that that we have a challenge here, because here is more work needs to be done. We have very good goals set by the directive, what we should be looking at, who are the vulnerables, but we need to make it then more operational. I mean, the measures need to be more operational. Vulnerability, for example, was changing during the energy crisis. So therefore, a very operational, good understanding who the vulnerable are and what kind of criteria should be looked at to see, how vulnerability increases or decreases, that needs to be on the table. And then we will need also to assist again, and I repeat, we would need to assist all users to lower consumption. So you don't have only a vulnerability focus, but you should be having an overall focus on what would you like to do with your consumption and how would you like that they would respond, how they could decrease consumption, and how they could eventually become more efficient in this changing energy system with more renewables. Next slide. And this is the final slide, and maybe these are some important takeaways from the report. Again, I'm promoting the report to read it. It's very colorful, so you can dive into the various topics. We have lots of things on vulnerability, bills, comparison tools, and it's very interesting. It sheds more light on the information issues that are very important for the consumers. And I would close with this information element here today. And so, what is important that we have good comparison tools so consumers would understand who the best suppliers are for them. Also, it's important that the consumers also understand their energy bills. And then those are transparent and informative as described in our legislation. And then it's very important to have a good understanding on the contract uptake. We are changing our energy system. We are transitioning with more renewables in the system. So we need to understand what is the contract uptake and whether we have more dynamic contracts, and then how those would function, what kind of information profiles we would love to have with those contracts, because dynamic contracts may not cover all the risks. So that should be also very clear, for example, for the consumers. Then it's very important the consumer complaint process, because we would need to understand where is a problem with the service. There were lots of complaints about the quality of service during the crisis, and obviously that's kind of a difficult setting when the prices are increasing, that everybody's under pressure, suppliers included. The situation gets tighter. So how the service is provided, that's on one hand. So it's kind of very crisis relevant, but you also can go beyond. You know, there should be a quality of service. There should be a good understanding what is provided to the consumers. So consumer complaints are very important. And then consumer information campaigns, they were quite important during the crisis. But also they are very important going ahead and embarking on the energy transition, because the consumer information campaigns help eventually to reduce demand in peak periods, help also consumers to react, help consumers to create energy savings, and all those elements will be very important going forward. With that, I'm giving back the floor to Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. I think you've touched on some of the key issues and the lessons that we have to learn, the different trade-offs that we have as well, not ourselves directly, maybe policymakers and leaders when they manage these situations in crisis. Hopefully, we've seen the worst of it, and we're prepared for the next crisis or contingency planning going forward, but doing our best to target and to reduce costs for consumers, but also for our economies. So without wanting to detract in terms of the timing, just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, you can put them into the Slido, and we'll come back to them after the presentation. So feel free to pick apart the data or any of the findings in the report if you've already had a chance to have a look at it. Right. Next, some practical experiences and trends across Europe from Philip Lewis. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Just to say hello, everyone, and thanks a lot. It's great to be here. And just to say that first up, when we're talking about demand, we're talking about consumption here in this case, and not load. And it's important that we understand that sort of the focus of that. And then just to also say that, of course, what I'm presenting here, this workshop is really just a very high-level overview of the analysis that we did. We did an awful lot of analysis. This is very much just a summary of that. And of course, there's a lot more in the report, and there was even a lot more that we actually did that of course, was only summarized in the report, but just to say that it's based on an awful lot of analysis that was done. So next slide. When we look overall at the demand, and we're looking here at aggregated demand, so this is residential demand and also industrial demand put together, you get a certain picture, and that picture, generally speaking, is a little bit different for electricity from gas, but nevertheless, you do see that when you compare the demand in 2022 with demand as it was in the previous years, and just to be really clear, those previous years do also include some low periods of demand, for example, during COVID. The level of demand, especially in the later months of 2022, were fairly low or below the levels that they were in previous years. Now, when you look at this graph here, or these two graphs here, you see that there is a clear difference. Many people might claim that the difference isn't that massive, but there is nevertheless a significant difference that we can see. The reason, you might ask, why is it lower towards the later months? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons, of course, is that over time the prices were increasing. They continued to increase. And of course, consumers' bills react a little bit slower than the actual price increases. On the wholesale market, it takes time for prices to react and takes even longer for those bills based on those prices to come through to people's homes. And of course, then even longer for people to then respond to those prices. So there is some time lag, significant time lag. So that's one reason for the difference. The other difference, of course, is that over time, well, in the later months, it's colder. When it's colder, there's more opportunity to save. There's more reason to save for that reason. And also the fact that, of course, in the weather was relatively cool in those later months, and therefore the temperature differentiation was also quite substantial as well. And one other thing was that, of course, awareness was increasing over time. Customers' understanding of ways to lower their demand, and also solutions that they were given, and sometimes their actual purchasing reactions through getting certain solutions were also coming through as well. So the reason why, but nevertheless, you see that it does appear to be lower, but some would argue not a particularly dramatic impact in any case. Next slide. And if we then look at the bigger picture from a modeling point of view, so what we actually did, we also, in addition to just looking at the numbers, we also modeled what would the numbers, or what should the numbers, what would we expect the numbers to be like if we took into account the weather, if we took into account seasonality and other variability adjustments, excluding the crisis. What would we expect the demand to be then? Was the demand that actually took place lower than that, or was it not? And yes, it was lower. So we found a similar picture to just looking at the numbers in many respects. In this case, we see that the gas is not particularly much lower than would have been expected, but it was lower. Electricity had a slightly bigger differential. Bear in mind that we're still talking about aggregated demand here, so residential and industrial combined. If we look at the next slide, now if we look at across Europe as a whole, we do actually see absolute reductions. So we actually see for most markets, there were reductions. These are the absolute aggregated reductions again. There are some exceptions to that, which I'll explain a little bit later, but there are absolute reductions across Europe. And again, if we looked at the modeling results, so the demand versus the modeled expectations, we see quite a similar picture as well. Next slide. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper and we look at certain markets in particular, because there are many markets, that we looked at all the markets, but just to take a few as examples, then we actually see that, for example, in Belgium, the lowest demand for 7 years during the later months there, during February, but also during October and November in 22, we saw the lowest demand for 7 years. Residential demand in particular went down about 6%, industrial demand about 2% during the year as a whole. So, okay, significant differences, arguably not massive, but definitely reductions in any case. And if you go to the next slide, yes. And if you look at Germany, in the case of Germany, residential went down around about 11%, industrial around about 14% during 2022. And again, with these markers that we showed, the reductions are also reductions, even when we're comparing against the modeled expectations. as well. Next slide. And Britain, actually, very large reductions in Great Britain as well. Electricity went down 3% for residential and 13% for industrial. Again, you might argue that they're modest in the case of residential, but nevertheless, we are seeing reductions in these cases. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see that, well, there are also other notable examples and falls also in some other markets for electricity, for example, in Latvia, in Slovenia, and if you go to the next slide, also to a bigger extent, actually, in the case of gas, for example, Czech Republic, Netherlands, Ireland, Latvia, Portugal, Spain, to name a few examples of those reductions. So we're kind of seeing reductions generally across the board, or in a large number of those markets. And if you go to the next slide, it's also a very key question, of course, which is so how much impact does the price, or did the price, have on these demand reductions? And also the question will be, well, okay, would the demand reductions have been bigger had we had less interventions in the price? If those prices had just been let to rise in the retail side to a greater degree, or to a natural degree, if we hadn't actually inhibited those increases? It's a very good question. Well, if we look at the relationship between prices and demand, we do see a clear relationship between prices and demand. Demand is reduced when prices are higher. There is a time lag, and that time lag can be quite substantial. But in general, you can say that the prices are lower. If you actually look at the and you can see this for both electricity and gas. The question then would be, okay, is that demand? So how much would that demand have been even lower if the measures had not been applied? It's very hard to say. We have to also bear in mind that, of course, there are many consumers that are unable to reduce demand because they maybe don't really have anything that is controllable, especially in the case of electricity. Or maybe they're already controlling demand as much as they were. Maybe they can't turn down the heating much. Or maybe they just simply don't know, or they might be vulnerable customers who are not really aware, despite their communications, how they can actually do it, or the best ways to do it. So I think it's important to realize that there are some important sort of dynamics at play here. And it's not as simple as just saying increase price, reduce demand. But nevertheless, we can see that strong relationship in the demand. And I would just also like to say that some of those exceptions in this relationship are for numerous reasons. For example, Belgium, in the case of residential, they have a large number of customers moving over to the social tariff. In Slovakia, for example, prices that generally didn't change, and we saw that in Chile's presentation. And also Sweden, for example, with a high penetration, rapidly increasing penetration of EVs. And also, for example, Ireland in the case of industrial, where we see a very large increase in demand relating to, for example, ICT industry. And so that can, of course, affect the dynamics. But just important to realize that if you affect the price, you will affect the demand change as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That's very interesting to see, in fact, the relationships and in real, data and the analysis, how it can help us to understand what's been happening across our different countries. I think this the importance of not just price, because there is that lag, but also reaching out to consumers and explaining the need in a crisis situation to save energy, to help us all manage, because we have scarcity and security of supply concerns, and it becomes critical, particularly in some countries. I think that's very much part of the equation, and I'm really glad that we have Sarah now to share with us the Irish experience. You showed us, Philip, some data about reductions in consumption in Ireland, and maybe here we'll find out a little bit more about how that came about.
Great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Dunn, and I'm a Stakeholder and Communications Manager in ESB Networks. And I sit on a team called the National Network Local Connections Programme. And I'm going to talk to you today about our suite of Beat the Peak initiatives, but focusing primarily on the domestic one. So if we go on to the first slide here. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the Irish market, so I'll just give you a little background of who we are. So I work for ESB Networks, and we're the distribution system operator in Ireland. So, you know, we're responsible for building, operating and developing the electricity network in Ireland. And we have over 3,500 staff. Ireland, along with everyone else on the call, has ambitious climate action targets. So the role for ESB Networks is to deliver resilient infrastructure to decarbonise electricity and empower all electricity customers. So if we just move on to the next slide, we're preparing for 2030. So we're getting ready for homes, farms and businesses all over the country to become more reliant on electricity. And Ireland has the target of 80% renewable electricity to powering our network by 2030. So the challenge is as Ireland transitions from our dependency on fossil fuels to renewable generation, there will be at times, particularly at peak times, a gap in generation and supply. So ESB Networks, in collaboration with our regulator, industry and department, were tasked to mobilise a range of initiatives called Beat the Peak, which includes both domestic and commercial initiatives. So for today, I will focus on domestic, but the opportunity we kind of have is how can we support customers, all electricity customers in Ireland, to control their consumption and start driving some real behavioural change to support climate action targets, essentially supporting the introduction of demand side flexibility in Ireland. So just on to the next slide. So before we began to kind of think about how we'd communicate these initiatives to customers and how we'd stand them up, we mobilized a huge amount of research. And we needed to understand, you know, the sentiment in the market and where people are at in their kind of electricity consumption journey. So what we found out is, in general, customers in Ireland didn't know when peak time was or what it was. And they'd support in security supply initiatives, but for a reward, you know, there had to be something in it for them. Customers did want to kind of support and get involved, but what they did not want is to feel lectured or, you know, any kind of condescending sort of messaging. You know, people were aware of wind farms and solar panels, but they weren't necessarily kind of sure of the role of renewables in Ireland and the kind of the targets facing us today. And in general, customers wanted something in it for me. So what can you give me so I can take control? So the insight kind of was, if you think about it, people don't think about electricity, you know, well, maybe they do now, but at this stage, you walk into a room, you turn on a light, you're not thinking about the detail, you're not thinking of where it's coming from or how it's being generated. So our job is to move people from, I use electricity when I need it without thinking about the time of day mattering, to I understand that time actually does matter and the time I choose to use electricity matters. So I want to sign up to this program, to this pilot, to learn how to take my control of my electricity usage. So our job was to start educating customers that how and when we use electricity does matter, and we'd invite them to take part in our pilot, or Is This a Good Time pilot, to empower them to take control. So if we go on to the next slide, we started to develop really clear and simple messaging, demonstrating kind of heavy consumption domestic products on an everyday kind of life. So you'll see some of the images, there's washing machines, there's irons, there's hair dryers. You know, we've developed an energy currency to get people to start just thinking differently. And, you know, we're not selling electricity. So from us to come out with these messages, we're kind of trusted because we're doing it for the best interest of the customer. So we really wanted to encourage people before they were using a device to stop and think, like, is this a good time to use it? Is it the right time for Ireland and for kind of the renewable targets? So if you go on to the next slide, we developed 2 TV ads. One was around kind of, you know, a lady engaging with her dishwasher, trying to figure out if it's the right time to put the dishwasher on. They look outside, the wind is blowing, means renewable electricity is being generated. So it is a good time. And the ad we'll show you now is around peak time. I was watching it yesterday with a fresh eye, and it is actually very Irish. There's a lot of kind of slang. So any crack does mean any news. So hopefully you understand it anyway and get the kind of picture of it if you want to press play there. So you can kind of see there the tone is gentle, a little bit humorous, but it's not lecturing. It's not telling people what to do, but it's trying to create an education and awareness of like what you could do and how you could support. And then you can imagine with the wind blowing and the dishwasher as well. So if we move on then, so we're trying to target a mass audience, you know, the population of Ireland essentially. So we developed a range of personas and tried to imagine their customer experience and their journey. So you can meet Mary here. Mary was like very start of her kind of taking control of her electricity journey. So if you imagine her journey, she might have seen the ad on TV or heard it on the radio. Maybe she got an ad on Facebook or met people promoting it in a shopping centre. So Mary's interest was piqued. So she visited our website, and on the website she could read a little bit more about what would it mean if she took part in this pilot. So Mary decided to continue and sign up. And when she signed up, we gave Mary the option. She didn't have to give us more information. You know, did she work from home, or was she retired? Was there kids in the house, or older kids, younger kids? You know, what was she into? Did she like cleaning? Did she watch sports? Kind of, you know, so we could understand Mary and give her a little bit more personalized information. So once Mary completed signing up, she started receiving regular educational content, you know, with lots of tips, tricks, and advice of how to take control. So I'm just going to read this from my notebook, but I just took down one of the texts she might have gotten, which would be, you know, Mary, do you enjoy fridge gazing? For every 1 minute the fridge door is open, it takes 10 minutes to cool it back down. Unnecessarily opening and closing your fridge door can waste over 100 kilowatts a year, which is the equivalent of 50 washing machine cycles. So we're not talking to Mary about money, but what we are talking to Mary is in this energy currency, kind of comparing devices and trying to get her to understand what devices use more electricity and kind of examples of what's wastage or what's kind of a good way to take control, like swapping an oven for an air fryer, for example, could be another one. So we invited Mary to take part in what we called energy events. So these are peak events, so they are to support in times of security of supply, and flexibility events. So we'd actually let Mary know when it's a good time to turn on her appliances because there's lots of wind out, or on contrast when there was less wind than expected. So Mary might get the text saying, you know, hi Mary, to support security of supply today, it might be a good time to postpone the laundry till after 8. Again, we weren't telling Mary what to do, but we were just giving her an idea of how she could help. So we'd then, after that, send Mary an email to say, hey Mary, did you take this action or not? And we'd reward Mary for taking the action and changing her behaviour in terms of supporting security of supply and driving that behavioural change. So if we just move on to the next slide, look, there's lots of kind of facts and figures and metrics of performance. So I won't go into everything, but we had we wanted to recruit 15,000 people onto this pilot to be able to test and learn the impact of it. And we recruited 18,000, and these 18,000 were so highly engaged. 88% wanted to take part in the energy events and did so frequently. We saw over 40,000 actions of behavioural change taken. So when we went out and asked customers to, you know, use that times when there was lots of wind or times to support security supply, you know, we saw those actions being taken. You know, we were emailing these customers, you were sending them an SMS nearly once a week, and 91% were happy with that level of frequency and communications, which is, you know, really interesting because customers just have this appetite to keep learning more. We invited them onto research focus groups in their own spare time, you know, evenings, and 30% filled in a form to tell us they'd love to give their input into future iterations. So this incredible base where they're living this kind of dream for us. You know, we did have a media plan there, and we saw the awareness of peak time grow in the general public by 23%. So we're starting to really get into the market and, you know, start this thought process with people. And what was really great as well is, you know, everything we do is in collaboration, you know, with our regulator, with the department, with different stakeholders, and all these stakeholders, whether through their business websites and social media or personally, we're sharing the messages and really getting involved and kind of backing us and becoming influencers in the campaign, inviting people from networks to present at their conferences and everything. So we got really, really good backing in the industry in Ireland, which was really incredible. So just to kind of summarize where we're at in the next slide, after the kind of success of the pilot, we've just launched iteration 2 of this. So we're hoping to have an even more personalized adventure, personalized journey for new customers, and we'll reward customers for taking behavioral change at times, you know, when we prompt them to. So good times and times to support security of supply. We'll segment even further. So, you know, we understand there's customers at the very beginning of their journey who want the basics, but then there's the customers who have the solar panels who are living this journey. So we're going to segment the communications even further. So we're talking to the people at the right tone for their level of the journey, and we'll be bringing people through this kind of, you know, awareness to them getting intent to act and understanding to actually acting and promoting. So we're really excited to see how it goes. So I'm not sure if there's many in the Irish market, so you need an Irish phone number, but if you're in the Irish market, esbnetworks.ie/weather has all the information of how to sign up and get involved. So we'd love your support, and we're excited to see where we go from here. So that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Really interesting. I want a talking washing machine. Go find one of them. No, we have really quite a lot of, I think, very interesting discussions and information from all of our speakers this afternoon. And we have now a bit of time for questions and discussion. We've got some coming in on the Slido, which I can already share. But just to reiterate to anybody else who's got any questions, either about consumption across Europe and how it was affected, the crisis measures that Sheila was presenting, some of the results and how we saw prices and support schemes across Europe evolve over the period, and of course communication and participation by consumers in managing our overall system needs. So we have quite a diverse range of issues, and I think well, we could be here all afternoon, but maybe I'll pick up on the first question I see here on Slido, which is an interesting one, and I could answer for Portugal, but I'll hand it over to the panel first. Did the industrial reduction in demand for energy result in an increase in output, productivity, profitability of those industries? Is there a metric that has measured this kind of demand destruction, as we call it? Maybe, yeah, I was going to volunteer you, Philip.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I personally, I haven't sort of seen, if we're talking about the damage that's done to industry that had to reduce their demand, just to bear in mind, of course, that some of that industry that was reducing their demand was not necessarily reducing their output. Of course, some of it was just using different forms of energy to some extent. And of course, there are cases of companies that have made good money out of selling energy contracts as well during that period. But of course, yes, there's a lot of evidence, a lot of anecdotal evidence, at least, of companies that suffered greatly during that time because, of course, they weren't able to produce, or if they had to reduce and still they suffered. So I haven't personally seen the data on at a sort of macro level, but certainly anecdotally there's a lot. But it does work nevertheless in both directions from what I've seen. Don't know what the other panel members think.
I mean, I can share the anecdote here. We have a lot, as you can imagine, Portuguese porcelain. Maybe you don't know, but it's quite famous. And they cannot do a fuel switch very easily in terms of their ovens. Same for glass making. So it wasn't a question for them of finding another source of energy, and a lot of businesses were able to do that. But you know, these sectors that we know very well need very high temperatures, and they need gases in order to reach those temperatures. They really struggled, and so we saw quite a few companies close altogether because there was no alternative for them. The fuel prices became so high that it became untenable to continue to produce, whether it was porcelain or glass or other goods that really rely on very high temperatures for their processes.
And I think important to remember to realize that I didn't sort of state it specifically, but generally speaking, the lion's share of demand reduction across Europe was industrial, right? It was industrial, or at least of various different sizes. So in terms of the impact on segments, that was, in a sense, the greatest impact through the demand side.
A lot of questions coming in now about the demand reduction. So we have another one here. As statistically, we see that there was demand reduction, but at the same time, also for the case of Portugal, solar panels increased by 200% in the last year. So is some of that reduction people just having their own consumption and not needing the grid and the system anymore?
Yes, I mean, for some, yes, that is definitely does have an impact. Of course, when we're modeling it, of course, we're looking at the trends, and those trends include some uptick in those uses as well. Of course, for sure, there is and it works in both ways again, right? Because of course there is a massive increase in solar, and an increase in even storage, for example. But at the same time, there also has been a massive increase in electrification, and so that would also have an impact in the other direction, of course. Sort of separating all these factors out is something we've been trying to do. We still believe that there has been a substantial reduction net of that, but it's very important to consider those elements, because for sure, allowing for the fact that if at the same time as reducing your demand, you are also massively increasing the uptake of EVs, then that's complicating it, as is the uptake of solar. So it's a very good point to make, and trying to separate those out is difficult. But I think once we do the modeling, it appears to us very clearly that there is nevertheless a reduction which goes beyond those factors. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very good. And maybe now looking at gas demand reduction, Sheila and Philip, if you have any thoughts. There's a question here about what about CCGT, combined cycle gas turbine consumption? Was that also reflected in the demand reduction trends?
Yeah, just to be clear, so we're not taking into account the demand for generation in any of this. So this is looking at demand, and it's a very good point. Just to be really clear where we get the data from, there is Eurostat data to some extent on the overall basis. Looking at segments, we got the data mostly from the network companies, for example, and suppliers. And so the data we got was very granular data, very, very detailed, and split up by very specific use types. And one of those was ESB, and very, very useful data. And so basically, just to be clear, that the data we got is granular enough that we can separate all that out. So no, we didn't include any of that.
Fair enough.
On my side,
Sheila.
that I can do. So I mean, I think there is also a national aspect, so you can also have specific situations, and that may relate also to the crisis measure that were employed in different countries, and also on like how the countries are relying on what kind of energy mix. So there maybe you had a more prominent role of CCGTs, and there were moments when those were supported to step in certain moments. We had a shortage during summer last year in some of the nuclear, for example, in France, and then you had more reliance on gas during also tight periods. It's a complex question. I certainly underline it, because you would need to separate. So you have an outcome that you see, but then you have to move behind the scenes, and then you have to see, what are the elements that are impacting the picture that you are seeing, and then you have to go into the various facets, what the industrials are doing, what the power generation is doing, what households are doing, and that is not always underpinned with data. I think here we have an effort to look into more corners and pick up relevant analysis.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Certainly, Portugal, we went through a drought. We used to have a lot of hydro. Last year, we didn't have that much water to produce the electricity, so we had no choice but to use a lot of natural gas. So our natural gas consumption went up in some respects. But I think we've seen there's a lot of questions here about the nature of the reductions. So, and I don't know if Sarah, also from the experience in the pilots, if you can comment whether you think that some of these reductions through the measures that you're doing in the pilots, whether these reductions are permanent and sustainable to a certain extent, or whether they were temporary and, we expect that consumption will go back up?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I guess, in Ireland, we've a 15 to 20% flexibility demand target for 2025, and I think it's a 30% or 25% by 2030. So I don't think this reduction in demand will be going anywhere. We'll just, we'll have over the next number of years, you'll see a range of solutions and kind of, technologies to support it and different schemes and initiatives. We're going to be relying on the energy from wind and sun, as time goes to achieve this flexibility. We'll be working with commercial customers in terms of, how they can support in times of security of supply, in times when the wind isn't blowing. So I think we're only actually at the start of our journey. So even like you think of our communications, they're very simple. They're very much aligning consumption with the wind and the sun, because it's getting people to start thinking that way. It doesn't happen, behavioral change doesn't happen overnight. So I think it's very exciting. We have consultations out at the moment for our flexibility multi-year plans. So these are focused at domestic customers, commercial customers, kind of infrastructure. So we're at a really exciting start of the demand reduction piece. So
I think there's a question here that's being liked by quite a few people, related to the availability of different kinds of automated services. And I think that's an interesting question. And I know some markets and some suppliers and service providers already have these kind of tools where you can access a contract as a consumer, which allows for price triggered appliance steering. So it helps you automatically to choose either the heating or different appliances in the house. Is it very common? Do any of the panelists, are you aware of how many, if this is something that consumers can access easily?
like we in networks, we sometimes refer to Jane as the future energy customer. Jane could be anyone. And we kind of imagine like Jane in the future, her home and her devices align to renewable electricity. So her car charges at the time when the wind is blowing. Her supplier has tariffs to match this. She's living this dream. Her solar panels produce the energy she needs in the immediate. So I think it's all on the way. It's all on the way in the future.
I know. Sorry, Philip, after you.
There you go.
No, we've been having this discussion, parentheses, publicity for other CR work we've done this summer. We just published a report on electric mobility. And we look at a lot of regulatory issues there, either for the system and the networks, but also consumer protection. And one of the things that came out in that exercise, that work, was that what they're calling smart charging. So instead of people just getting home and plugging in the car because they just got home and so they plug in the car even though it's peak time, the system itself, the car or the charger they're plugging into, decides when is a good time to actually start charging the car. So not immediately when that car gets plugged in, but maybe it'll start doing it at midnight instead of when I plug it in. So it's smart for me, and it helps the system, avoid the peak, but also it's doing it in the cheaper hours for me as the owner. So these kind of different tools are emerging, I would say, to help people with that kind of automated service management and price management. Sorry, Philip.
Yeah, no, just to say that there are a number of factors that, of course, need to be coming together. I mean, if we look at the Nordics, for example, we have a huge number of customers that are on hourly prices. And a lot of those customers will have EVs now, and those customers are naturally, of course, charging when it's cheapest, and of course automating that is a great advantage for them. And generally speaking, so you see a massive impact of that in practice. And in other markets, of course, it's restricted by whether the tariffs are available. You're seeing some elements, as you saw in Ireland, certainly in Britain, certainly in the Nordics, and some other markets. Where that you both have the control and the tariffs to go with it. But there are many markets, of course, still where you don't have the option of those tariffs. And we're seeing a massive increase in hybrid tariffs that are coming around with a mixture of sort of fixed and variable elements and tariffs and control elements and so on. But generally speaking, there are still a lot of markets that don't either have enough smart metering, or they don't have enough tariffs that are suitable to encourage the timely use of energy, or they don't have enough uptake of the appliances and technologies that will actually give a reason to shift or be able to shift. So I think that there's still an awful long way to go before we can before we get a big impact Europe-wide. But certainly we have a lot of examples of where that's now happening. But tariffs are going to be a big driver of that, tariffs that actually incentivize that. I mean, I'm just myself an example of that. I have an EV, and every day I look at, I don't have the smart charging, but every day I look at the price I have, and it's an hourly price. And of course, I charge the car when it's cheapest. And the difference is massive. The difference means if I charge it 1 hour, it may be almost nothing. If I charge, it might be 20 cents to charge the car. And if I charge another time, it might be 10 euros, 15 euros to charge the car. It's a huge difference.
Yeah, it allows you to use your household income and on other things that is not necessarily energy. So that's important. It's all about choices and opportunity costs for all of us managing our homes and our household income. So we have other questions here. Maybe one for Jana I see here regarding, there's a question here, should these subsidies and support schemes that have been put in place during the crisis, should they be made more permanent going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. A good point. Actually, that is what we have been discussed or also shared on slides from Chile, showing the price interventions that we are through that we are losing the price signals, and in the economics, that the whole economics works on price signals. So we have to be aware of that and find the proper level to, on one side, to help, but on the other side, we have to still stay fit for our market, still be well functioning, and we have to keep the price signals so that everybody can be served in the end, and we do not create a burden for the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important to target and make sure that the system can work on its own 2 feet, as they say, to the extent possible. If we can get business back on track and the energy system back to a less critical stage and functioning. So there's a lot of questions that I think are interrelated. So I'm kind of merging here several ideas, but there's the question of, how do we keep people's engagement in demand reduction, in a demand response, in sustainability, even if prices do start to go down, and it's not, it's not so critical to be aware of your pocketbook because it's, more affordable. And at the same time, we're electrifying everything. And there's a question here saying, if we're, how do you save? Isn't saving about less devices and less consumption of energy and electricity? So it means having less gadgets in your house and et cetera. So how do you reconcile all of these things of we're electrifying and we've got a lot more stuff that uses electricity, prices are going down, and hopefully, they'll level out to a more acceptable level for most of us. How do you manage this and keep people engaged and saying, okay, you've got to save, you have to save, and let's try to beat the peak, for example?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's a great question. For the domestic side, so the reason I've called what we've done so far a pilot is because it was our chance to test and learn. So what I didn't go into the detail is how we did some of that testing and learning. So in terms of customers who opted to take part in the energy event, so the times we tell them it's good or to help with security supply, we tested different reward mechanisms. So a portion of the pilot participants got no reward. They were just doing it because it's the right thing to do. A portion of the participants got rewarded before they did anything, so paying them a voucher roughly at about €5 per event. Another cohort got paid after they participated in an event, and then another cohort got a charity donation made on their behalf. So it was really interesting. But what we could see is that the monetary payments worked the best, and then the post-pay, so paying after participation. So our research has always kind of said, people want what's in it for them, and they don't want the kind of make a movement together. They want the me element of it. Like they want the, how can I do this for me? So whether it's reducing their bill by changing some of their behaviors, supporting security supply, if there's something in it for them, they'll take part, and then it's a nice added benefit to support kind of the sustainability measures and to support the kind of country, but it really is about what's easy for me. So we did a lot of behavioral research, and before we even launched the campaign, and we basically tested these events out. And there was kind of a mother of young kids, a single mother of young kids, and we asked her not to use electricity between 5 and 7, and the next day she came back and she was kind of saying that was impossible. I had to put on the wash, I had to bathe the kids, cook the dinner. So we gave her some solutions, and it was kind of like, well, why don't you heat the water before 5? You could just do a quick boost. Do you have an air fryer? Yes. So maybe why don't you cook in the air fryer instead? And then why don't you put the clothes in the wash but time it to come on? So then the next day she's like, okay, that was feasible. I could do this and I could take control. So it was those small changes that made such a difference. And then even just in the commercial side, like we're working on our winter initiatives, but last year we had some schemes where, you know, businesses got rewarded for moving consumption outside of peak times. But we also had is what we called a commercial pledge. So it was companies who aren't just like talking the talk, they're walking the walk. So, you know, one example we had is on Post, which is Ireland's postal network, and they changed how they operate their big logistics centre. They changed all their lighting. They committed that no more than 50% of their electric fleet would charge during peak times, and so on and so forth. So we could tell their story, and I can't remember what their megawatt reduction was, but it was significant. So I think, you know, it's getting people involved and showing those kind of benefits. Like on Plus, then we're leading the way for other companies, and then we were getting a lot more interest from people to kind of be like, okay, how can we support? And these were butchers, or they were small shops, or they were bigger businesses, you know. So it's the reward element, and it's kind of, you know, showing that benefit in terms of the corporate world is what I'd see anyway.
Can I just say that yeah. Just to go back to what Jana was saying, you know, as well, nevertheless, that we still need to keep the customer's eye on prices as well. I mean, let's not forget that before the crisis, exactly as you were saying, Sarah, before the crisis, the general view was, what do I care about electricity prices, especially in particular? A little bit different with gas, you know, because you've got the heating element. But generally speaking, the idea is that the general view is that it's the cost of a cup of coffee or something every day, and who cares if I save a bit or not. And then added to that, the fact that with demand response, one of the challenges is that generally speaking, demand response, as important as it is, extremely important, but the normally payments from demand response are not enough to pay for the infrastructure to deliver it on its own. You have to add it to other value chains to actually pay for all of that equipment. So I think we mustn't forget that the importance of the level of prices to those that can afford, and bear in mind vulnerable customers, of course, bear in mind not everyone can save, but nevertheless, you know, the concern is that prices have come down a lot. Wholesale prices have come down, retail prices a bit less, but nevertheless they are still quite high, but they could come down further, or they could go up a little bit. Realistically, they would go up an awful lot if those measures were all taken off that still remain on those prices. But the issue is that if we keep the measures in place, if the underlying prices go down a lot, we have to be, I think, a little bit cautious if the prices go back to a level where customers, again, don't care enough. And I think that so it's kind of keeping their eye on the ball through the prices, so that you know, the great measures that Sarah's talking about are sort of as sort of relevant in their lives as possible. It's a tricky thing, because on the one hand, you're trying to focus on prices to keep them high enough to have an impact, but at the same time, low enough that they're affordable, and certainly targeted enough measures to make sure that those that can't are protected. Don't know what your view is, Chile.
Eventually, I wanted to make a little bit a connection on the price element, you know, like how they would potentially go down. I think the gas markets are still very tight, so the pressure is still on, unless we are adding other resources that are different from gas. So that's one element. But then this also connects to the previous round of questions, you know, like what kind of prices you would like to see. And I think the time of use tariffication would become important, because there you would capture the situation that there is kind of a tightness in the system where you would see higher prices, and there will be moments in the system when prices are more affordable, and so then obviously that would push the consumption to the right period of time. And for that, of course, you would need to have different policy measures, and you would need to think about whether you have regulated prices and whether there's a strong price intervention in the country, and how you would change that gradually to create a meaningful path for the consumers who are kind of used for something which is super stable, and showing that on the slides, or and how to move from that point to a different one where you would see different prices, and at the same time you would be participating in order to reduce your bill and make the consumption payable. And of course, all this with the caveat that you might have vulnerable users who have a lot more limited playground, or they can move around, and then take that into account. So
I think that's very much in line with some of the questions we had in the chat and in the Slido as well about the issue of prices. So if we have subsidies or regulated prices, do they not diminish or destroy, if you will, the price signal for consumers to be able to adjust their consumption? And in the long run, is this not a problem to encourage this participation? And I think both Sheila and Philip kind of answered the question before I'd even asked it. So basically, price signals are important for efficiency, for management, for demand response, and I think the campaign pilot that the Irish are doing shows that there is very much a response to a price. We all respond to money talks, as the expression goes. So we all respond to the impact it has in our pocketbooks. And it is interesting, the more we understand people and consumers, the more behavioral science and economics that we can apply in the energy sector, the better we will be able to manage the overall system, but engage with people and convince them that it's worth their time and effort as well, and their pocketbooks, not only. So there are lots of different drivers. It's interesting you said one of the benefits you gave was charities, and that some people were driven by some kind of charity benefit that you would give on their behalf. So that's different people respond to different things. So that's also very interesting to see. I had one last question, and I think it's for everybody. Whose job is it to organize awareness building campaigns for consumers and society about peak hours, about your energy behavior, about costs? Who should take this on? And is it is it a clear-cut answer? Kick off with Jana. Put the regulator on the spot if I can.
Yeah, okay. So let's start with the regulator. Of course, it's our role to protect consumers. So it should be also our role to provide them with proper information, to guide them, to make also alerts and warnings on that. And that all in collaboration with all the stakeholders on the market. That means consumer protection organization, that means supplier, that means also the DSOs. And maybe a helpful campaigns and those cases we aware of. It's good to share also among us and to find the best tools. And as we could see today also in such a video, I think that's helpful for everybody, and take from that challenges the best, and make lessons learned for the future.
Very good. So inspire, replicate, emulate, and spread the word far and wide between all of us. Anything else to add from the panel?
Can I just say one thing that I think is important from this whole experience is that in a lot of markets there is not very much data to identify demand levels, certainly not at a granular level, and so you do hear a lot of statements from certain stakeholders saying that that all the successes that were achieved and the demand that was reduced, but in many markets there just isn't data to back that up. I think one thing that is really important moving forwards, in order to, as a centralized, if there is going to be some centralized effort to to have more impact on demand, it's necessary that they actually know what the level of demand is, because otherwise you can't track the measures versus the impact. And in many markets, you don't even know what the level of demand of residential versus industrial is, unless you really dig. And I think that's one thing going forwards that would help the measures. In the case of Ireland, you've got good data. In some other markets, they don't. And I think that's critical going forwards.
No, I think that's a very valuable lesson. To understand what's happening, we need the information and the numbers to really be able to know what works, what doesn't work, and where we can target temporary support or more sustainable market-wide solutions. So absolutely agree with that. Perhaps on that note, I'll do a 30-second conclusion, which is basically to thank our speakers and thank you for your examples, thank you for your time and for answering all of our questions. And also on behalf of CEER and ACER to say that we very much will continue our analysis, trying to understand prices patterns, try to understand consumer demand as well, and also the consumer protection policies, measures, and see if they're working for our consumers across Europe. We'll be back next year with a new report, also looking over time, and we always try to maintain the trends over time to see before, after, and recent, and to see if there are changes. We have a lot of legislation coming out, being negotiated. In time, it should also bear fruit, if you will, on impacts in the market and in our different market actors. And as regulators, of course, we'll supervise a lot of those provisions in the functioning of our electricity and gas markets, but we keep monitoring and we keep adapting as well, especially considering the decarbonization and all the targets that as a society we've placed on ourselves. So thank you very much to everybody. Any other questions, you're always welcome to send by email to our institutions. And in the meantime, happy reading. And we hope you'll find our market monitoring report useful and interesting. Have a good afternoon.